Welcome to The Courage Contagion. I'm your host, Joelle Benson. I'm so glad that you're here. And as we've been doing in the Plant a Seed series, we are taking a look at subjects that either are unknown to you, or maybe they are and they're settled in your mind, and we are going to turn them on their head, or at least look at them from a different perspective. And as much as I hate to, we are going to circle back to some of the COVID issues. As I heard on the radio recently, officials were saying that they are warning the public of a summer COVID spike scare with new symptoms, including a razor blade throat. And that they would like the public to take certain precautions, going back to mask wearing and limiting summer gatherings. And I thought, here we go again. And yes, people are going to do that. They're going to modify their behavior based on some perceived fear. And that for me is really hard, because you know that I don't like modifying behavior based on fear. And the more knowledge that we have, the better decisions that we can make. So what if I were to tell you, and you already know this about me, but that COVID isn't something to fear in the way that they tell us to fear it? But what if I told you that viruses don't actually make us sick? What if I told you that viruses don't even exist at all? I know that last assertion might have you reeling. I know it did for me when I first heard it. So for that, I have brought on an expert, someone who has spent many more hours researching this topic. In fact, he's written a book about it called An End to Upside Down Medicine. Sorry, Mark, if I butchered that, but I will have the link for you in the show description. That's not the only book he's written. He's authored a series of 7 in the Upside Down series that cover topics such as cosmology, economics, UFOs, you name it. There's a plethora of things for you to check out, but I definitely want you to check out the book that we're going to be talking about today. It's well written, very well organized, very informative, and a lot more detail on this subject than we're going to be able to get into today. So definitely check that out. But with that caveat behind us and that introduction, let's bring him to the show. Mark, welcome to The Courage Contagion.
Thank you so much for having me.
Really glad to have you here. We gave a short snippet of your bio just on your recent authorship, but will you give us a little more detail about you, your history, education, and so forth?
I never expected to write books. I worked in finance after graduating from Princeton. I was in investment banking in New York at a bank called UBS. I was there during the financial crisis of 2008 until 2010, and then I left and joined a firm in Silicon Valley where I was advising technology-focused companies, primarily as it related to their intellectual property and patented technologies. So that was my world until about 2016, when I was initially just listening to podcasts, but then I started to have interests outside the office, where I was reading books and scientific papers on the nature of consciousness and who and what are we as human beings? Is there a soul? Questions like that, which are really outside of mainstream scientific thinking. But I was coming across scientific evidence from credible places like the University of Virginia. At their medical school, there's a division of perceptual studies, and the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which I'm now on the board of, and also the US government's declassified documentation of very strange phenomena of consciousness and things that they were funding and investing in. So that shifted my life very dramatically, and it led me on this path to question many paradigms. At the time, this in 2016, I didn't know I was going to write any books. And when I wrote my first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, which was published in 2018, I thought I was done. And I had just become a partner at my firm. I thought I was going to have this one book and it would be a passion project on the side, and I would continue advising technology companies. But that is not what happened. I decided to leave the firm at the end of 2019, early 2020, because I just felt like I wasn't fully aligned. And little did I know that I would end up exploring so many other topics, now to the point of 7 different books, the 6th of which is the one you mentioned, An End to Upside Down Medicine. And this book has the genesis. I could actually take it back to 2016, because when I was exploring the nature of consciousness, I was coming across many alternative ideas with regard to the nature of reality. And that included things like energy healing and alternative diets and just things that were outside of the allopathic system that I was exploring. just to try to make myself healthier as I was learning about new topics. So it's always been top of mind for me to explore health. When 2020 happened, of course, all of us around the world had to look at health because it was the centerpiece of most discussions, and our lives were being changed because of what government and medical officials were saying, basically, about the assumptions they had about our health. I was not questioning viruses or contagion or anything like that in 2020. I do remember that I came across some doctors who were asking questions, like Dr. Andrew Kaufman, who's MIT trained, very smart guy. He's actually one of the two classically trained doctors who read my book closely before it was published. The other one is Dr. Mark Bailey from New Zealand. So I'm not a doctor myself, but I'm acting more like a journalist, and I had these two doctors read and review the book. But in any event, I came across Dr. Andrew Kaufman's work early in 2020 because there was this spectrum of alternative views that I encountered among those who were questioning the narrative in early 2020. There were some people who said, yes, there's a virus that's making people sick, but it's way less serious than most people are telling us, and we shouldn't be shutting down the world, and masks are not going to help us, and they're actually very detrimental. And then there were some people talking about the injections, and that everything happening in 2020 was an agenda to try to get people injected and to control the population, and it was politically motivated. And then there were these people on the fringe, very few of them, Dr. Andrew Kaufman, Dr. Tom Cowan, Drs. Mark and Sam Bailey, and a few others saying, yeah, all that other stuff is right, and there is no such thing as SARS-CoV-2. That virus doesn't even exist. And I was like, okay, that sounds crazy. But when I heard them speak, they were getting into the details of methodology, basically, of what goes on inside a virology lab. So when I listened to it, my instinct was, this sounds too far out, but I also can't dismiss it because I haven't looked at the arguments they're making. I just don't know enough, but it sounds like it's too crazy. And there were a lot of people that I encountered who were questioning the narrative, generally speaking, but when they heard about this idea of no SARS-CoV-2 virus, they were making the claim, this is just some kind of psychological operation that is being put into the health freedom movement to basically distract people and discredit all the valid critiques of the injections and other things, the political issues. And these people are coming in saying the SARS-CoV-2 doesn't exist. It's a big problem. We shouldn't be listening to them. And by the way, Joel, it wasn't just SARS-CoV-2 that they were questioning. They were going back to the foundations of virology and saying there has never been any virus that's been established to exist. So I parked that in the corner of my mind. A lot of people I respected were saying this is not something to look at. And 2023 is when I first started to look at it, because I was writing other books, and I just said, okay, let's see what happens with this, because it would seem like you could just dismiss the argument pretty easily and it will go away if it were missing something big. And then 2023 hits, and I was asked to be involved in a series, which I recommend to your audience. It's called The End of COVID, available at theendofcovid.com. It's over 100 hours of content, which I was a participant in, talking about political issues. But because I was a participant, I got to listen to many of the other interviews and episodes once it came out in the summer of 2023. So I listened to Dr. Tom Cowan and others talk about the arguments with regard to viruses. And it was through Alex Zeck of the Way Forward podcast and Mike Winter of Alpha Vedic podcast, who became friends of mine. So they were just kind of nudging me. Hey, Mark, you should take a look at this. It actually aligns with a lot of other things you're doing with regard to consciousness. This is an important one you should look at. And I was very resistant at the time. So when I wrote this book, Joel, in the fall of 2023, I wrote it almost as a practice exercise to see if there was even an argument there, because I wasn't sure if it was going to be compelling enough. And it wasn't just questioning viruses. I think this is an important caveat. What I was looking at is, what are the determinants of health and disease more broadly? What are the psychospiritual issues that could be involved? What about toxins in the environment? What about EMFs and electricity? What about other things that we don't even understand in science? How do bacteria fit in, and fungi and parasites? Like what's the interplay of all this stuff? But viruses, that's an important part of it, because in the modern allopathic approach, the germ theory of disease is huge. The idea that there are these microscopic things that can make us sick and go from one person or organism to another one and make a healthy organism sick through a process that's microscopic, and we assume it's happening, and that's the way we're going to treat illness. So I had to look at the germ theory of disease, because allopathic medicine is very reductionistic. It likes to look at these individual things. It's like one little cause where you're going to take one pill and that's going to be the cure, which I think is a simplistic way of looking at it, rather than trying to really understand the root causes. So that's how this book came about. And the long story short is the way the science has been conducted with regard to germ theory in general, not just viruses, but also bacteria and fungi and parasites, arguably, which let me just segment this for your audience. I haven't come across anyone who says that bacteria don't exist or that fungi don't exist or that parasites don't exist, at least the big ones. The small ones I've heard some debate about, like protozoa, but I haven't looked into that as much. So that category, let's say those microbes exist. The question with regard to those microbes is whether or not they're actually causing disease, meaning they're launching attacks on healthy tissue, or in the alternative, whether they show up at the scene when the body has some underlying toxicity or some adaptive mechanism. And these microbes are coming in because they're able to clear out stuff. So bacteria, for example, in nature, they're often known to be saprophytic, meaning they help to decompose dead and dying tissue. So the bacteria will come to basically clean up. They're a cleanup crew. It's like firefighters putting out a fire. And if this alternative perspective is right, you wouldn't say firefighters caused the fire. No, you say the firefighters are there to put out the fire. So when there's a lot of bacteria, what we call an infection from this alternative perspective, yeah, there's an infection because there's a lot of bacteria needed to help clean up this underlying toxicity. That's the real root cause. And we could say the same thing about large parasites and fungi. So that's one category. Those things exist. The question is, what is their role? Viruses, separate issue. Do they even exist at all? Or in the alternative, are there other reasons people are getting sick? There's no denying people get sick and there are symptoms and they can even die because the symptoms are so severe. The question is, what's causing it? Is it a microscopic virus or are there some other reasons that science is not adequately acknowledging?
Well, and as you say in your book, the problem with allopathic medicine is it looks at the human body as a machine, so to speak. Like it's this physical thing, A plus B equals C, and we can just, if we get the right component in place, it'll fix it. But it's negating that we are spiritual, electrical, really complicated beings. And so maybe take a minute to help our audience understand that American medicine wasn't always this way. I mean, we grew up in an era where we think, allopathic medicine, that's the only thing. But there is a whole history where there were a lot of other modalities available to people to kind of take in that part of the human body that we don't even know about today, or people do, but it's not mainstream. So would you talk just a little bit about the history? Like, why are we so pigeonholed in our country into one type of medicine? And what are maybe some of the downfalls of that?
There is a famous report known as the Flexner Report. It came out in 1910, and it was supported by the Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. And it describes a shift in the way that medicine would be taught and approached, basically. Moving away from holistic thinking, things like homeopathy, for example, and moving into this allopathic approach, which to me, the two main characteristics of allopathic medicine are that it's reductionistic. It likes to find a single material cause rather than psychospiritual things. And it also likes to focus on symptoms rather than the root cause of illness. So it's like, okay, you had the symptom, let's put a Band-Aid on it and get you back to work, rather than trying to understand, well, why is that symptom there in the first place? Yes, you're sick, but why fundamentally at a deep level are you sick? So we've moved into this mode almost like of emergency medicine as the main way of thinking about treating people rather than getting to the root cause. And I am very critical of the allopathic approach in the book, but I'm clear in the beginning, in the introductory chapter, to say that there are instances in which we need allopathic medicine, especially with emergencies and acute issues where you might need to put a Band-Aid on. And allopathic medicine is great for that. The problem is that when that becomes the rule rather than the exception, and we are clearly in a big problem in the US where chronic illness is at an incredible rate and people are not healthy by and large. So something is not working in the system.
I like to think about all the different ways that we keep our family healthy. And I know that you are going to circle back to this, I hope, maybe at the end, and you can share throughout your studies. There is good news at the end of this. And I would like to make sure we bookmark that and come back to different ways that we can pursue health in a comprehensive way. So let's not forget to get back there. But what I want to dig into next is specifically you identified that viruses are unique, that bacteria and parasites and so forth exist. But what is wrong with virology? Why is virology as a hierarchy just problematic?
This is really a question about the history of medicine. That's what I realized when I got into it. And I think what I was distracted by, and perhaps others in the field of just alternative health, they saw everything happening with COVID. And then all of a sudden, this new group emerged saying viruses don't exist. And it was like, well, if that were true, maybe we would have learned that earlier. But what I didn't realize is that we need to go way back prior to COVID. COVID just happened to accentuate issues that had been beneath the surface for a while. So the word virus comes from a Greek term, eos, which means slimy poison. And so the word virus for a very long time meant poison. And then if we fast forward to the 1800s, late 1800s, Louis Pasteur, who's a famous advocate of germ theory, he was studying rabies and he was seeing these very severe symptoms, but he couldn't find a particle that was responsible for the symptoms. And basically, he concluded there must be something so small here that's being transmitted, and that's what's causing the symptoms with regard to rabies. And that was the attitude for a while until the early 1930s, and then the 40s and 50s, this technology became more prominent. The electron microscope was able to see things that are as small as a virus is alleged to be. That's one of the key issues with viruses. They're supposed to be so small that we can't see them without advanced technology. In 1954, there was a classic study that's now the gold standard for what's known as viral isolation. That was a big event, which is really not that long ago when you think about it. And then 1953 was the Watson and Crick study on the double helix structure of DNA, which is very important for virology because a virus now is believed to be this intracellular parasite that replicates inside of a host cell. And you need to have an understanding of genetics to even have that kind of hypothesis. So that was a big event in 1953. And then there was something else happening around the same time, and a Nobel Prize was awarded later for it, known as the bacteriophage. The bacteriophage in mainstream medicine is believed to be a virus-like particle that infects bacteria. Although if you ask some of the doctors I've spoken with now, they believe the bacteriophage is something that emerges when you put bacteria in a stressed environment. The bacteriophages are actually not parasites or viruses at all. They're just show up when you stress bacteria. But in any event, most mainstream doctors would say a bacteriophage is a virus-like particle specific to bacteria. So you have these three events. That's at least how I see it in the 50s and onward of, okay, now we have genetics. We had this isolation experiment in 1954. We have bacteriophages, which were virus-like particles for bacteria. Now we have a framework to maybe explain why people are getting sick and other organisms are getting sick. This microscopic intracellular parasite that uses genetics. Okay, now we can finally explain why people are getting sick because for so long we weren't exactly sure. Now we have a mechanism for it. The problem is we have to dive into what is this supposed mechanism, because a virus now has a very specific definition. Like I said, it's an intracellular parasite, meaning it's something that gets inside of a host cell in an organism. It will replicate and then burst out of that cell, go into other cells in the organism's body. And in this process, it's causing physical symptoms in the organism, making them sick. And then it jumps from one organism into another one and does the same process. The problem is what I just described to you, no one has ever seen one of those things. Think about it. No one has ever seen what I just described of what a virus is supposed to be. Everything we have with regard to alleged viruses is based on indirect evidence. Mm-hmm. So let's go to this 1954 study of the alleged isolation of the virus. And ultimately, we'll talk about methodologies here, but the problems deal with logic and reasoning more than anything else, where people are jumping to conclusions about what happened based on inference rather than direct evidence. Direct evidence would be, well, a virus is supposed to be this intracellular parasite moving around, getting inside a host cell. We should be able to capture that. That would be direct. We don't have that. So we've never seen it. That's very important. But we have this indirect method of it's called the cell culture method. And I'm going to simplify this to try to make it as easy as possible for your audience. But basically, in 1954, Enders and Peoples, and Enders won a Nobel Prize later that year, so he's a very well-respected guy. They took fluids from a sick person who had what they call measles. And to me, measles now just means a very specific set of symptoms. But to them, they presupposed, okay, this is someone who has a viral condition that's causing these measles symptoms. So they said, well, why don't we take fluids from this person? And we're going to take these fluids, which we presuppose has a virus in it, and we'll filter them partially. But we're going to take these fluids from a sick person, and we're going to put it inside of a soup of material. And this soup is called a cell culture. And in the soup are things like antibiotics and monkey kidney cells and a host of other substances. So they take the fluids from a sick person, they put it in the cell culture that has these other things in it, and they observe whether or not cells break down in the cell culture soup after the fluids from a sick person have been added. And the thinking is, well, if there's a virus in those fluids, we would see cells breaking down when we add the fluids from a sick person into the cell culture. What happens? They see cells breaking down in the cell culture soup after adding the fluids from a sick person, and they conclude there was a virus. That's what they call viral isolation. There are a bunch of problems here, a lot of problems. Number one, they've changed the definition of the term isolation. Isolation in the dictionary means to separate one thing from all other things. As Dr. Tom Cowan says, if you want to isolate a hammer from a toolbox, you would take the hammer out of the toolbox, and then you could study the hammer, you could characterize it, you could analyze it fully. Very simple. That's not what they're doing in that viral isolation study. They're inferring a virus was causing those things that they saw. That's not direct evidence of a virus. So it's not, you don't end up with an independent variable. This is really the key. Mm-hmm. If you truly isolated one thing from all the other things, you would have an individual entity that you could then add into an experiment and see what it does in that experiment. So that's the independent variable. It's the thing in the scientific method that you add to the experiment, and then you can see what the effects are. If you don't have a sample of just a virus by itself, how do you know that anything is happening because of a virus? If you haven't found the virus first, you run into all kinds of problems. So this cell culture method, which is now the gold standard of quote unquote viral isolation from 1954, it succumbs to a logical fallacy, which I cannot emphasize enough. It's called affirming the consequent. If X, then Y, Y, therefore X. Another way to say it is, it's true that when it rains, the grass outside will be wet. Second statement, I observe wet grass outside. Therefore, I conclude that it rained. Mm-hmm. There are many other reasons grass can be wet, like sprinklers or dew or children running by and pouring buckets of water, thousands, millions of explanations. So another way to say this logical fallacy is that people often jump to a causal explanation of observations. There's a distinction between observing something like cells breaking down and knowing why the cells broke down. Same thing. People getting sick because they went to a party. We observe that. Do we know why? Was it a virus? Was it something else that we don't know? There's a distinction between an observation and the cause of the observation. Another way to say this is, it's possible that a model can accurately explain an observation and still be incorrect. For example, it's true that if there were a virus in the sample, that cells would break down based on the model that we assume about the virus. It's true that that model of the virus would explain that observation, but it might not be the right model because there are other possible explanations for it. So that's a really big logical issue here. They didn't get an independent variable in these studies, and they didn't show that it was a virus necessarily causing these issues. So we run into an issue, another logical fallacy. It's called the reification fallacy, where you speak of something that's actually an abstraction that's never been identified. You use the word over and over and over again. And in so doing, you reify its existence. So we're speaking about viruses very often as if they've been established, but they never have been. And the last thing I'll say before I pause here, this is probably what tipped me over the edge in terms of feeling comfortable writing a book on the subject. Because like I said, I had a lot of trepidation. I have trepidation with all the books, but this one I was like, I don't know. This is maybe too much. But then I saw work from Christine Massey in Canada. She and her colleagues around the world have submitted freedom of information requests. So you could submit a request to the CDC or other health organizations, for example. And you can ask them, please send me records of a virus in a purified state without passing it through a cell culture, for example. And they specify in these letters what they want. And repeatedly, with SARS-CoV-2, it's 40 countries, over 200 health organizations. They've all said the same thing. We have no records responsive to what you're saying. Even one, a health organization in Canada, said, what you're asking for violates the gold standard of viral isolation, which always involves using a cell culture. So of course, we don't have any records of this. So they are admitting all over the world, there is no purified sample of a virus just by itself. And it's not just SARS-CoV-2. They've asked this for many other viruses. And on her website, Christine Massey's website, fluoride free, can't remember exactly what it is. You can read these for yourself, that no one has evidence of a virus just by itself, meaning that no study using an alleged virus has an independent variable. And if you don't have an independent variable, you can't run proper controls. And you need to have an independent variable and proper controls in order to follow the scientific method. So that means virology does not follow the scientific method. And I'll just pause there.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I hear you're saying is that we don't have the proper experiment being done. We have no control. We have no isolation. Therefore, has there ever been a virus that's been isolated truly? Not the misnomer and the changing of language isolation, but like really on its own. Because then, of course, the question is, you may have listed, several other substances that were in that cell culture, and we don't know unless we try each one individually if they're having the effect of the cell damage. I mean, that's basic scientific method. And so it's a big problem. That's a whole field of science. And I don't want to say quote unquote science because I don't want to be rude, but that's a whole area that we have these basic assumptions that we build other areas of science on top of. And I think that's what I want to get into next, because these are not just scientific issues. These now have become societal and psychological issues. I mean, we have this idea now that there's a substance in me that can jump from me and attack you. Now that makes me I'm a danger to you. And what does that do to society? I think we all saw that during COVID, of how dangerous that can be for people groups. And what I want you to touch on next, if you would, I found this really fascinating, and I can't remember the names of the exact studies, but I think it was during the Spanish flu, but they were trying to prove contagion, that this can jump from one person to another, one animal to another, because anybody who's listening right now is going to say, well, that's all fine and dandy, Joelle. You can say that contagion doesn't exist or it doesn't jump from one person to another, but I've seen it. I've experienced it 100 times. My kid goes to school one day and their class has got this, and then now we have it, or my family passes the flu to one another. And I think that's why this idea or this theory, as faulty as it may be, has staying power because we've all experienced it. So will you go and take some time and talk about, there are scientists who tried to prove contagion and what their outcomes were?
Sure. And let me start with the logic first, because I know what you're asking, and it's something I've had to really work through in my own psychology, because we do see people getting together and then afterwards a bunch of them get sick with similar symptoms, or a child comes home and then people in the family get sick. It's true that if there were a contagious virus, that we would see this pattern of illness. Is it true that because we see this pattern of illness, that a virus is the only explanation for those symptoms? I would say no. We use the word caught. I went to a party and caught something. So we are imposing a cause on top of an observation. So that to use technical terminology, epidemiology refers to patterns of sickness. These are things that we observe, but that doesn't tell us the cause of the observations. So let's think about many possibilities here. So people go to a party, a bunch of them get sick. First of all, it's typically the case that not everyone gets sick. That's kind of weird if you're dealing with something so contagious. But then what happens? Dr. Tom Cowan calls it inventive reasoning. You make something up. Well, those people, they had some kind of immunity because their immune system that no one's ever found, that's fighting these viruses no one's ever found, for example, is that better able to fight it off. And you come up with these explanations, post hoc rationalizations, which are very legitimate hypotheses, but you'd have to test them to validate that they're actually true. So in any event, the patterns don't always work perfectly because not everyone gets sick. And then sometimes some people get sick, but it's different severities. So the symptoms might be somewhat similar, but not everyone has the exact same symptoms. But let's just take this case where, okay, it looks like maybe contagion could explain what's going on here. What are other possibilities? What are other common things people have been exposed to that might have nothing to do with a microbe, such as a virus? Let's say they went to a party and there were toxins in the building, and some people reacted strongly to those toxins. Or maybe the air was unclean, or maybe there was food poisoning, or maybe there was some kind of radiation or very strong electricity that messed with some people, or there was a smart meter and there was a lot of EMFs. Or what if there are other areas that we don't understand in science very well, like the human biofield and resonance between biofields? Like, for example, when women cohabitate, sometimes their menstrual cycles will synchronize. Sometimes when one person yawns, another person will yawn very shortly thereafter. So in these cases, there's no particle that we're thinking of in terms of a microbe, but maybe there's something energetic. what if we get into the realm of the human psyche, where if there was some kind of a trauma that people were similarly exposed to, or at least they perceived it that way, then maybe they had a similar reaction to it. Or there's a field called German New Medicine, where often when people resolve a psychic conflict, after they resolve the conflict, their body will essentially, I'm just simplifying this, will flush out the excess that was needed when their body was dealing with that conflict. So after they've resolved the conflict, they end up having symptoms. So maybe people similarly resolved a conflict, and then afterwards they had similar symptoms. What I'm trying to do for your audience is to give a range of possibilities of other reasons people might get sick that have nothing to do with the virus. So to say I caught something is superimposing a cause when it might not necessarily be true. And the answer to why people get sick, maybe it's none of the above of what I said. Maybe there's some other part of science that we don't understand fully. We don't have to know the exact answer in order to say, well, that hypothesis that they've demonstrated, they say is true, hasn't been established. So it's possible to say, I know that's not true. I'm not sure what is true. Therefore, I don't know why we got sick. I know it's a very uncomfortable thing, but we might end up in that position. So that's the logical framework that I think is super important to keep in mind here. But with regard to your question specifically of some of these experiments of trying to demonstrate contagion, there is a new book that came out by Daniel Roitas. It's called Can You Catch a Cold? And it documents over 200 experiments where scientists have tried to transmit a cold virus unsuccessfully, basically. That's the short version of it. They were not able to do it. And Dr. Tom Cowan has been saying this repeatedly. He says, I want some people to just send me some studies that show when you have sick organisms, put them with healthy organisms, and then show me that the healthy ones got sick. You mentioned a study with regard to Spanish flu, and I talk about this in my book, the Rosenau Studies. The Spanish flu was this devastating condition, allegedly viral, that was so contagious and causing such problems. And yet in the Rosenau Studies, when scientists tried to transmit this alleged virus, they had sick people doing everything possible, basically, to try to make the healthy ones sick, including coughing in the faces of healthy people, transmitting fluids from sick people to healthy people. No one got sick in these studies. They were unable to transmit any illness. This is a big problem. So when we look at some of the studies that allegedly have demonstrated contagion, like take polio, for example, the early studies, one of the examples was taking unpurified samples, which included spinal fluids, and injecting those into the brain of a monkey. So whatever they had in there, they presupposed there was a virus in there, but it wasn't just a virus if it was there at all. And they injected it in the monkey brain, and the monkey got sick, and they said, okay, that was demonstration of contagion. Number one, that's uncontrolled. You'd want to have animal ethics aside for a second, maybe you'd want to just like inject saline fluid into a monkey brain and see if that causes illness, or maybe just injecting anything in a monkey brain would cause sickness. It doesn't have to be viral. But you'd want to have the virus just by itself and see if introducing that to a monkey causes illness. And you'd want to do it in a natural way. I mean, polio isn't being transmitted allegedly by people injecting stuff into other people's brains. It's supposed to be this other thing. Often viruses are supposed to be airborne, or you get it by touching something. That's natural transmission. What we see in these alleged contagion studies over and over again is unnatural transmission means of taking an unpurified sample where the scientists presuppose there's a virus in there, they inject it into an animal, and the animal gets sick, sometimes not even with the exact symptoms they want, but they say, okay, we've demonstrated contagion. So again, it's an instance of sloppy science. And one more point before I pause here, because your audience might be wondering, well, Mark, what are you talking about? I just went on Google and I saw a picture of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. You're out of your mind, Mark. Okay, my question would then be, what are you looking at in that picture? And how do you know that that is an intracellular parasite that gets inside of a host cell and causes disease symptoms and goes from one person to another? What are you actually looking at? What you're looking at is something that has been observed under an electron microscope, assuming you're not looking at a CGI image, because there are some just computer-generated images. But we do know from electron microscopy, people look under an electron microscope and they see this structure sometimes, which we call a virus. The problem is it's always done from an unpurified sample. So there's other stuff in the sample, because I discussed earlier what this cell culture method is about. So you could have fluids from a sick person that are non-viral and other particles from the sick person. You could have things from the cell culture that you're looking at. You don't know what you're looking at. And then you've taken it and put it under an electron microscope. And in that process, you have to slice it up. You stain it with some kind of a resin. You end up with something outside of the natural organism's body in a laboratory after you've already killed it and messed with it. And you point to one thing that is static, meaning it's not moving and it's dead, and you point to it and you say, that thing is the virus that was supposed to be living and moving around inside the host organism. We just say that thing is the virus. And you do it the first time for some viral condition. And that becomes the basically baseline morphology. And you say, okay, well, that's what SARS-CoV-2 looks like. Anytime we see that in another electron microscope, we're going to presuppose that that is the virus involved in it. And you can see how you end up with a house of cards based on inferences. Same thing with genetics. If you're looking at an alleged genomic sequence of SARS-CoV-2 or some other alleged virus, if you wanted to do that purely, you would have to have a sample of just the virus by itself. So all of these alleged sequences that you're taking are from a virus rather than from some other thing that you're mixing up in a computer and doing some kind of, it ends up being a black box in terms of how they stitch this together. But ideally, you'd have just the virus by itself, and then you would sequence the virus. But as Dr. Mark Bailey says, he wrote a paper called A Farewell to Virology, which I recommend. It's online, available for free. A Farewell to Virology. He says, you end up with genetic sequences of unknown provenance, meaning these genetic sequences, you don't know where they came from. You'd have to have the virus first by itself to know that you're sequencing a virus. So hopefully that gives your audience some perspective here that anytime we use the word viral, whether it's viral contagion, viral protein, viral antigen, viral antibody, antiviral medication, they're always making presuppositions that a virus is attached rather than maybe we are observing something that has nothing to do with the virus.
And even further, and I think this is an interesting way to look at it as well. You mentioned German New Medicine. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Larry Palevsky out of New York, but I've heard him speak several times. And he talks about being a pediatrician or being a general physician in New York and being trained by all these older doctors who were looking at all these your typical childhood illnesses from a completely different perspective than he was. In his early medicine, a kid would come in and they'd have symptoms and he'd prescribe a medicine to take the fever down or whatever and try to get through this issue. And these older doctors really counseled him and said, don't you think there's a reason that every 3-year-old has this particular ailment, that maybe it's a developmental thing, that maybe part of their growth, they need to get through something, and this is their body's way of preparing them for the next stage, or to get rid of, maybe they had a major milestone and now they have to get rid of, different materials in the body. And so it shifted his mindset from these symptoms are something that need to be eradicated and suppressed to, hey, maybe this is a natural process in the body, and maybe we need to assist and help the body go through this thing. And he said when he shifted his perspective and viewed it, he noticed some things in his office that these older doctors said he would, which was, a child would have this major illness and then they would, have the rash and the mumps or whatever. And then they'd heal from it. And then guess what? They'd go through a huge growth spurt, or they'd have some major developmental advance. And it was because their body had to go through this thing and then they were able to do the next thing. And so it's just a totally different way of looking at our bodies. And I think from a faith perspective and understanding that our bodies were not just machines, that we were beautifully created, that these would be normal. If God created our bodies to do these things, it's for our advantage. And I think it is a total mind shift to say, we were created problematic, and that we, have these different things that we have to fix. Or what the vaccine issue is, God didn't create us perfectly, or we're faulty. And so when we encounter something naturally in our environment, now we need something a scientist made to make our bodies able to overcome it. It just really dethrones the creator and says, you didn't make us right. You didn't make us correctly, and now we need to amend our bodies with these substances and injections. And it's just a complete, like your book, it's a complete upside down way of looking at it. And I loved that. I love this idea that no, our bodies are pretty instinctual, and we can interact with our environment in a natural way. And maybe we do know how to handle some of these environmental things. So have you ever heard, I know that you're well versed in German New Medicine, but have you heard of Larry Palevsky at all?
Yes. And I agree with what you're saying, that we might need to look at symptoms differently, because a symptom is often regarded as something bad because it's typically uncomfortable. However, what if a symptom is part of an adaptive process of the body, where the body's needing to go through that process for some reason? And there's nuance to this, of course. Sometimes the symptom can be so severe that it could kill a person and we might need to handle it. But in other cases, maybe the symptom needs to work its way through. I also look at it from a spiritual perspective now, that we could look at symptoms as a way of reality or the divine, whatever you want to call it, showing us something about our life, and maybe trying to steer us in a certain direction, that maybe we've been in a direction that is problematic, or something where we're not optimizing, or maybe where we're going to encounter more suffering. So we could look at our health as a signposts of where we should be going to maybe have a smoother life that is more in alignment with where our soul is going. So to just suppress the symptoms could could hide the symptoms, really the signs. And then sometimes I wonder, if we suppress the symptoms, we're not getting to the root cause of what's going on. So maybe in the short term, we feel okay, but the root cause is still there and it could manifest as something more severe later. So that's part of the shift in the allopathic thinking, which is all about, let's just get rid of symptoms, versus more holistically, what is a symptom? What is the human body? Are we purely physical? Do we have a biofield? Is there some kind of spiritual resonance in our consciousness, in our soul, that we need to be considering many more things than just the physical, in which case we have to handle symptoms differently.
Absolutely. And I think that transitions us very well into some of your suggestions. I know you listed out in the end of your book of what are some ways that we can work with our bodies and with these symptoms to produce optimal health. So if you want to take a few moments to maybe go through some of those.
Yeah, and I would say the caveat here is these are areas for future exploration, because I feel always much more comfortable looking at a model that's been proposed and saying, this is how it hasn't been established using the scientific method, or these are the explicit holes in the model where it says this should happen and it doesn't. So I feel that way about a lot of what we've been told about germ theory, because it's not following the scientific method very often, and so forth. What you're asking now is really the ultimate question, like, why do we get sick? And then how can we work on our health in new ways? And I think we're all exploring that together, and hopefully funding will go into this alternative domain. The problem is we have so much of our funding going toward germ theory that these other things we're talking about are often based on hypothetical models or based on anecdotes that certain doctors or practitioners are working on and they see results, but we certainly need a lot more research. So with that caveat, I would say, like in my personal journey, looking at toxicity. What are the toxins in my environment? Clothing, toxins in food, diet. What am I putting in my body? What am I putting on my body? So we can get into those physical things, and then even energetic things like electricity and EMF and technologies to try to mitigate potential risk there. So looking at like toxicity in all areas of our life, looking at our nutrition, and looking at the EMFs. And there's a book called What Really Makes You Ill by Dawn Lester and David Parker, which is like a textbook on a lot of this stuff and goes through in amazing detail a lot of this. So I think on the physical side, I would think about those things. But then when we get into the psycho-spiritual realm, to me, that's where I like to focus a lot of my attention. Of number one, what's our mindset? Because mindset, this gets into another topic where my journey started. My first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, is all about the idea that consciousness, the part of us that's experiencing, is not something that comes out of our brain. It doesn't just pop out. And it might be the reverse, that our brain and our body, it's sort of like we're a vehicle for consciousness, a vehicle for a soul, let's say. And that all of reality at some level actually might be made out of consciousness. What we call material might not be as physical as we think, and that consciousness can affect the physical world, maybe in subtle ways, maybe in significant ways. So that I give that preface because if our body's not purely physical and if our consciousness is way more powerful, then it could be that our mindset is actually molding reality for us and actually affecting our physical body in ways that we don't appreciate. So that means if there's any hint of truth to that, we have to look at our thoughts, our subconscious beliefs, the things we're telling ourselves, the things we're taking in from people. What are our emotions? What are our traumas? And working through that, I think that's a huge part of health. And we talked about German new medicine earlier, which is along those lines. This is a field, I'm not an expert on it, but I'm very interested in it. Dr. Hammer in Germany in the late 70s and early 80s discovered using brain scans that there are lesions in the brain that correspond to certain types of conflict shocks a person had in his or her life, which correspond to ailments in an organ. Meaning that if you look at a lot of these examples over and over again, when a person has a certain symptom, they can say, we've seen this pattern before. You probably had this kind of a conflict shock, this kind of separation conflict or self-devaluation and so forth. And basically a conflict shock is defined, again, this is general terms, as something that's very distressing, something that you feel isolated in dealing with. So there are these certain qualities to it. And it's something that was unexpected. And then when you resolve that conflict very often after the body was building up all this defenses to resolve it, sometimes there are symptoms that you have afterwards. Sometimes also the symptoms can occur while you're in the conflict phase. The point is, if there's truth to that, we need to be looking at, okay, did I have a conflict recently that either emerged or resolved? And how can I work on my own psyche such that I don't perceive world events or life events as being so conflicting? Because it's really about how we perceive the events, not just because we could look, Joelle, and we could have the same thing happen to both of us. And you could perceive it one way, and I could perceive it as traumatizing, and you're totally cool with it, and I'm not. My body perceives it as a conflict shock. So how can I get myself in a state where I'm not as responsive and stressed out by world events? That's a big deal, because if we get into a calmer state, for example, maybe our nervous system isn't going to be as activated and we can be healthier. And that's how I'm looking at health more and more, is the psycho-spiritual lens of really looking at our own internal state and how we're perceiving the world. And even from a spiritual perspective, how are we viewing life? And do we have purpose? Are we happy? Are we happy in our relationships? Are we dealing with past trauma? And then also looking at the world that's more physical, our diet, our EMFs, toxins, and probably some combination of all that, I would guess, is going to be the direction that new medicine is going to take us in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like for some listeners who have been steeped in this allopathic medicine or this rational worldview for so long are going to think that's just woo-woo nonsense. Like how I feel is going to affect my body or how I perceive stress. And I get that, but I think we are complex beings. And then there's been lots of studies done on water and plants and rice. And I'm sure you're familiar with these as well, where you see control studies done where they put different labels on different glasses of water and then freeze it and see what kind of crystals come up. And they can be positive words like love or hope or faith, or they're negative words like hatred. And, even children have done experiments where they have plants in the same window, same environmental conditions, and they speak words of life over one and words of death over another, and they thrive at different levels, or one shrivels up and dies. But what I find even more fascinating is, instead of even just printing the word on the glass or speaking it, is they've even gone further into where they just think negative thoughts over and towards a plant. And then they shift and they think positive. And so there's not even what we would consider a physical transmission happening, but a mental one. And it still has the same effect on these different plants and water and so forth. And I think that's really fascinating. I think what that means is there's a wide world that we don't fully understand. And it's not nuts or crazy. It's just that we haven't investigated fully. And I think there's a whole world of science that can be done there. Are you familiar with Dr. Rashid Buttar? He's since deceased. He was out of North Carolina. And I remember he was doing an interview once with Mike Adams, and they were talking about cancer. And he was an oncologist who was dealing with people who were in stage 3 and 4 cancer, doing pretty experimental stuff. And he basically said, I don't see any stage 4 cancer patients who are not suffering from either extreme bitterness or phobia. So when he gets to them, that's a common thread when he would interview all of his patients, and he would do a full emotional, psychological, physical review. And that was almost 99%. They were dealing with some major unresolved fear or unresolved bitterness. And I thought, that's something. I mean, that's not nothing, and I think we don't fully understand that we are mind and body and spirit. We're not just body. We're not just machines. And just because we haven't tangibly studied that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And so I think that there's a good opportunity for people to engage in that. And I hope to see that in the future. And I hope that my listeners, after hearing this interesting idea, walk away with a few things. One, don't freak out when they say there's a new spike, there's a new COVID variant floating around. You don't need to fear that. So I hope that you can walk away with that. 2, take heed to some of the things that Mark mentioned: being in good relationship, mentally reducing your stress, staying away from toxic things, whether it's food or water or people. I think I would also add, get into nature, get back into a natural environment. We're so isolated from the nature we're supposed to be in. Get your bare feet on the ground, get your eyes open to sun at all times of the day. Do your best to be in the world that God created for you, because there's such synergistic things that are happening with our environment and our body that we are isolated from. And I could say that's by design. And there's this really, big push to separate us from God and our environment. But that's a different podcast. I don't want to go down that trail today. I want to leave you with hope and with really great action steps. And definitely check out Mark's work that I'll link. And then, Mark, did you want to just take the last minute and tell people where else they can find you? I'll get your book, and a couple of the other websites that you mentioned, I will definitely link. But will you tell us where they can find you?
Sure. I have a website. It's my name, markgober.com, markgober.com. I have 7 books out in the Upside Down series today. What you spoke about, An End to Upside Down Medicine. All of the books are available in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible formats, and I narrate the audibles myself. I also have a podcast series which goes into the nature of consciousness. It's called Where Is My Mind, from 2019. It's an 8-episode bingeable series, so it's pretty quick. Goes into the science of psychic abilities, the science of the afterlife, near-death experiences, and shows that these things are not just science fiction, but there's actual research that's been done and has big implications for health as we really think about it. Because if we are more than just a body, then what does that mean for our health? If we're dealing with our body, and that's healthcare, then we need to really understand what the body is and what a human being is.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on today. I'm so thankful that you'd spend time with us. Dear listener, go check out all of his things, support him in the ways that you can. And until the next time, get your feet on the ground, get your eyes towards the sun, and be well, my friends. Take care.